The year is 2021. I'm sitting alone in my room with nothing but a cigarette and my own self-pity. How do you talk about the most talked about movie of all time while feeling like you're adding something to the discourse? And that's when it hit me. From an angle! This video is going to be political, critical, and liminal. This one is not for the reactionary film fans, for those who clutch their Criterion collection close and opine for the golden age of Hollywood. This one is going to be for you and me, baby boomers to Gen Z, anybody who for some reason loves this movie.
You know what time it is? It's about to be that time.
Do we think Casablanca is great because of a self-reinforcing loop, constantly placed on the top of the greatest movies of all time and therefore must be one of the greatest movies of all time? Is it because there had to be that movie, that one piece of media we all collectively use as a reference point for a particular slice of history? In this case, the beginning of World War II. Kind of like how I listen to Creedence Clearwater Revival and think, yeah, I have a pretty good idea of what it was like to be in Vietnam. Is it because of the great performances? As Ingrid Bergman herself put it, even the smallest part was filled by a top-class actor.
It was good also because all the parts were played by such good actors. The smallest part was really a top-class actor.
No. Well, I mean, maybe. Today we're going to be looking at Casablanca through a contemporary lens. And these glasses! I'm gonna argue that Casablanca's staying power comes not just from all of the things you've heard. The top-class acting, wonderful sets and costuming, that brilliant Max Steiner score, but from key progressive themes that continue to resonate to this day. I'm not out to argue that Casablanca is the greatest movie ever made. That honor goes to A Muppet's Christmas Carol. But I am out to ask why this old, fuddy-duddy movie from 80 years ago still holds water today. As always, I'm going to be drawing on a few key sources which I'm going to put on the screen now. Part 0. Rick Blaine, played by Humphrey Bogart, is an American expatriate living in French Morocco and the owner of a nightclub where everyone is welcome, unless you're a Nazi. In 1942, during the Second World War, his life is flipped turned upside down as Ilsa Lund, played by Ingrid Bergman, arrives in town with her husband, Victor Laszlo, a Czech freedom fighter and leading figure in La Marquise, The Resistance, played by Paul Heinried, who were on the run from the Nazis. Ilsa and Rick once shared a relationship at the start of the war in Paris, unbeknownst to Laszlo, who was at the time imprisoned in a German concentration camp. On the day of the German invasion of Paris, Ilsa abandoned Rick at a train station where they were meant to flee together, telling him that she will always love him, but ultimately not explaining why she must leave.
Oh, that's a lot of damage!
In the present, Rick, through some plot hackery, finds himself in the possession of unobtainium. I mean the One Ring. I mean the official letters of transit. Miracle Deus Ex Machina papers that would allow two people to leave together for America at any time. And the main tension of the story shifts to whether Rick will give those papers to Victor and Ilsa to flee, or to try and rekindle his romance for his own selfish ends. Gosh, when you put it that way, Rick sounds like kind of a spoiler alert. He doesn't. He actually helps them escape, even shooting a Nazi for good measure, ultimately running off into the night alongside a once corrupt and now slightly less corrupt and very gay Captain Louis Reynaud, played by Claude Rains.
Well,
And this was the start of a beautiful friendship.
Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
The end. All right, let's dig a little deeper.
I can't get over you two. She was asking about you earlier, Rick, in a way that made me extremely jealous.
Part 1. Resistance and Exigence. So I'm about the 80 millionth person to pick up on the very obvious themes of standing up against evil and fighting for what's right. But too often in the Casablanca discourse, are discussions of good versus evil wiped completely clean of their real-world political implications. Or if they are addressed, they're very surface-level comparisons, such as Rick Blaine, who sticks his head out for no one,
Stick my neck out for nobody.
representing the nearly 70% of Americans who were reluctant to join the war at the beginning of 1941. But let's be clear here, the evil in Casablanca is fascism. And to ignore the very anti-fascist themes, not just anti-Nazi, but anti-fascist, anti-authoritarian themes, or to simply give them a nod with surface-level jingoistic American-centric comparisons just seems wrong to me. There's an extremely well-written piece by Shone Matgamna over at Workers' Liberty that I'm going to reference a lot over the course of this video. They do pick up on Casablanca's very obvious anti-fascist themes, but comes down ultimately very critically of the movie.
It's pure ideology.
Their assertion is that its themes are muddled and hollow at best, and jingoistic and insidious at worst. All of their criticisms are extremely valid, and the piece is extraordinarily written, so I highly recommend you go and give it a read. However, I'm not as sour on Casablanca as Matgamna ultimately is, and in this section I want to talk about its anti-fascist themes because I feel like people don't talk about them enough. Matgamna even concedes that Casablanca is a very entertaining flick, made greater by the sum of its parts, that brilliant Max Steiner score, Michael Curtiz's German expressionist lighting, all of it. These elements never fail to stir a rousing sense of optimism at the end of every viewing. But more than just an abundance of talent and craftsmanship on display, I believe its anti-fascist messages are clear enough that they still manage to resonate with viewers in 2021. Especially when you remember that the story didn't start off as Hollywood jingoistic hokum. It was earnest theater hokum, created by a Jew trying to talk about the sweeping anti-Semitism that he experienced in Europe. The term exigence means, what is the purpose of this text? Not just what are its messages, but what was the occasion that prompted the author to write this text in the first place. In the case of our favorite movie here, that exigence was the sweeping anti-Semitism that was erupting out of Europe in 1938. Casablanca started as a play, the idea of Jewish playwright Murray Bennett and his wife while on trip in Europe in 1938, just before the outbreak of the war. The Burnetts were disturbed by the anti-Semitism that they experienced in particular in Austria, and they elected to get the heck out of Europe. On the way home, they stopped by a sleepy little inn in a French town called La Belle Aurore. La Belle Aurore.
La Belle Aurore.
And in its smoky embrace, they found all sorts of people taking refuge from the harshness of the world outside. Soldiers, refugees, there was even a black pianist singing old Tin Pan Alley standards.
You must remember this, a kiss is just a...
By Burnett's account, a great contrast to the tears and the tragedy outside. Murray returned home and with his writing partner, Joan Allison, wrote Everybody Comes to Rick's, a play based off the experience. The duo did at first try to get the play onto the stage, but eventually decided that it might end up better as a Hollywood movie. Eventually, the play found its ways into the hands of a Warner Brothers script reader who passed it along, stating, "Excellent melodrama, colorful, background, tense mood, suspenseful, psychological and physical conflict, tight plotting, sophisticated hokum, a box office natural for Bogart or Cagney or Raft, and out of the usual roles, and perhaps Mary Astor."
I disagree. Gary.
Warner quickly greenlit the project and handed it off to their hottest director, Michael Curtiz, the prolific but temperamental filmmaker who you may know from Yankee Doodle Dandy, The Adventures of Robin Hood, and Mildred Pierce. Hey everybody, this is Editor Adam here. I just wanted to pop in and leave a few bits of information that I felt were really important. One is that Burnett would later go on to have quite a serious grievance with Warner Brothers, claiming that they sort of downplayed his legacy, and you will see later on in the video that Ingrid Bergman believed that they were working without any type of underlying story, that they were working without a script, and Burnett would take great offense to that, saying that if they were working off of something, they were working off of his work. Second, he also, in this article I read, wanted to make sure that his writing partner, Joan Allison, got the credit that she deserved. And third is I just wanted to underline this aspect of Burnett wanting to capture in his writing the experience that he had. So there's this article here in the Jewish Chronicle that also talks about the sort of very Jewish origins of this story that were later downplayed, but he recalls seeing a huge billboard in Vienna Square with a grotesque caricature of a Jewish man and the words murderer and thief beneath it. He returned to New York and with Allison wrote Everybody Comes to Rick's in what he calls, quote, the white heat of anger at stupid people who refuse to acknowledge that Hitler and Nazism were a threat. So anyways, just to highlight that aspect. Back to the video. You're about to learn about propaganda. Okay, bye. And it's here that we must address why, in truth, Warner was so eager to get this project off the ground. By this point, Warner and other studios were fully plugged into the American propaganda war machine. And I mean fully. As stated earlier, in 1941, 70% of Americans were deeply, deeply isolationist and did not want to enter the war. So the US government tapped Hollywood to create a slew of movies that would rouse a sense of patriotism and duty and honor in the average American viewer. Eisenhower has merely served them well as an advance agent, was one quip from The New Yorker. There's a great video by 100 Years of Cinema exactly on this topic, and if you're more interested in learning about the propagandistic aspects of Casablanca, go give it a watch. But we must keep in mind, as Michael Curtiz once put it himself, he aimed with his movies to put in all the art the audience could stand. And he didn't want Casablanca to be what he called another flag boiler. He was a shrewd businessman, but he was an autocratic artist in the capital A sense of the word. Hell, one of his earlier movies, The Charge of the Light Brigade, killed at least 3 horses, and one flood scene from a movie put 38 people in the hospital.
That's a lot of
He was a proud American, but he was also an immigrant, a Hungarian Jew. And his decision to cast real refugees from Europe in the movie as soldiers or refugees in Rick's Cafe reflects that this project was indeed something personal to a lot of the people involved. It was reported that there were so many languages being spoken on film, and German in particular, that they referred to the set as the International House. And that famous scene where they sing La Marseillaise in defiance, the song of the French Republic, but in this case the song being representative of the French resistance, one actor was genuinely moved to tears because this wasn't just a movie to them. They were a real refugee. So let's talk about the resistance. Who was the resistance? The real one.
The ring is quite unique.
Oh yes, I'm very interested.
It's important to know that the resistance shown in Casablanca is a mythologized, homogeneous one that never existed. One where Victor Laszlo knows the names and identities of every single resistance head and all of the cells in all of Europe. Sure, Jan. The real French resistance was made up of different factions, and some, even as Matgamna put it, opposed each other, even murderously. According to Professor John Merriman, the most effective resistance came out of France from their organized labor movements, in particular the Communist Party, who was deeply embedded in all parts of France at the time of the war, and most importantly, had a lot of experience already sabotaging railroads.
That the advantage of the Communist Party had is that they already have organized. They have people in most every large village who represent the Communist Party. So it's easy to organize your comrades because you know who they are and you can trust them after all of these years.
When you need trains to transport soldiers, supplies, or weapons, it's a little hard to do that when you have saboteurs putting dynamite on the tracks a little up ahead. And as soon as that's fixed up, you go on your way and boom.
Another advantage the Communist Party had, and I alluded to this before, is they were basically the party of the cheminots, of the railroad workers and the engineers. And any station you go to Rouen sometime where I teach, and you look in the railroad station, it's just unbelievable. There's this huge plaque with about 200 names of cheminots, of railroad workers in the largest sense, who were killed, executed by the Nazis or by the French fascists.
Merriman says that the role of women in resistance cannot go understated, who put their lives constantly at risk to deliver messages and other vital tasks. There was resistance from Jews, and indeed even resistance from Catholics who broke with their more conservative brothers and sisters. So what, you're asking? What does this level of detail have to do with the movie?
Good question!
Some of the actors' real status as refugees, or the history of the French resistance, a lot of this is information that we know after the fact and get to some extent, project onto the film. But why it's important is because this word, resistance, is so evocative because we know it from films like Casablanca and Star Wars.
I'm Keith Olbermann, and this is The Resistance. I don't want to hear another word. You're a disgrace to the game.
Resistance is everywhere in Casablanca. It's what kicks off our plot. It's what brings Ilse Lund and Victor Laszlo to Rick's cafe. It's even indeed why Rick is in exile, although left mysterious, a request by Bogey himself.
Richard Blaine, American, age 37, cannot return to his country. The reason is a little vague.
Bogey wanted the character to be less of a sad sack than what was originally written, and he must have picked up on some of the more insidious tones that later critics would shine a light on and ask the writers to tone it down a bit. Bogey wanted the bulk, and so the bulk was given. New, chatty Rick Blaine has previously run guns against the fascists in Spain.
Right on.
And he's not allowed back in America, for reasons indeed a little vague, but one can project similar progressive reasons. I have to pee. To be honest, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to take this hat off. He asserts that he got well paid for it, but this too can be read as more of a front, and finances don't seem to be a motivating factor for this character at all.
Here you are.
Shall not happen again.
That's all right.
And indeed, resistance ends up being more important than love.
Why my name, Richard?
Because you're getting on that plane.
I don't understand. What about you?
I'm staying here with him till the plane gets safely away.
No, Richard, no. What has happened to you last night?
Last night we said a great many things.
But the important thing to know about resisting, about fighting fascism, is that fascism doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't exist in a bubble, in a political vacuum, and just suddenly spring forth when a group of elites decide, hey, time to do a fascism now. It needs a critical mass of people, of ordinary people, to stand by and allow it to happen, whether passively or actively. And in Vichy, France, where our story takes place, this is exactly what happened.
Thank you. I hope you'll forgive me, Captain. The present French administration hasn't always been so cordial.
Part 2. The Vichy Regime. The bulk of this research is taken from a lecture by Professor John Merriman in his Yale course that you can all go watch right now, France since 1871. In particular, there are 2 lectures, one on the Vichy regime and one on French resistance. Because Casablanca isn't set, well, anywhere, it's set in Casablanca, in French Morocco, the economic hub of an often brutal colonial regime in West Africa. We'll focus more on the colonial aspects in the next section, but on this section we're going to focus on the first half of French Morocco, the French part, and how the French in particular saw themselves during World War II. Vichy France is how we refer to the quasi-fascist authoritarian French government established by French military general Philippe Pétain in collaboration with the Nazis. A veteran of World War I, a hero of the Battle of Verdun, Pétain used the crisis to seize power and immediately rewrite the French constitution, rolling back progressive policies, enacting some extremely harsh policies, themselves some places even worse than the Reich. All of this was done under the pretense of saving the French state. But indeed, it was more of an opportunity for a certain number of people in France to create a state that they desired, one that was Catholic, one that had no Jews, no organized labor, no unions, no communists, no lazy bums.
In 1942, the rafle is the French word. Rafle, I mean, the sort of sweep in the Marais and on the Île Saint-Louis was not done by the Germans, who had been very happy to do it. You know, they didn't care, they'd do it. It was done by the French. It was done by the French police.
As Matgamna notes, this France is controlled by the French right. Royalists, political Catholics, patriotic anti-German fascists, people who think the revolution was a mistake and a crime, anti-Semites who round up French Jews and deliver them to the Gestapo and the death camps.
I have my orders.
France was divided into 2 zones, an occupied northern zone and a southern free zone that also included their African colonies. Vichy is a small spa town located just on the border of that north-south divide where the government operated out of, hence the Vichy regime. Vichy was made possible, of course, by the German occupation, but was also made possible by a large number of people in France who more than gladly went along with their anti-Semitic, anti-labor, anti-union policies and looked the other way.
the Germans didn't need to do lots of things because there were people in every population that were happy to be there. A better Hitler, to see them there. A better Hitler than Blum went to Schouts in 1934, 35, and 36.
And this idea is manifested in the true antagonist of our story, Captain Louis Renault, played with pomp and circumstance by the incredible Claude Rains, one of Warner Brothers' favorite actors at the time.
Well...
For it's Renault who will, on the one hand, smile at Rick and dote on him, and also, on the other hand, seek to undercut him and put him in very uncomfortable, difficult positions. Why? Simply because he can, because he finds it amusing, because it's his job, it's his day job to do these sorts of trivial authoritarian tasks. And so long as he performs his day job and goes on believing that he's not the worst person in the room, then that's what he's going to do.
Oh, I see. Gestapo spank.
My dear Ricky, you overestimate the influence of the Gestapo. I don't interfere with them, and they don't interfere with me. In Casablanca, I am master of my fate.
In his lecture, Vichy, The Dark Years, Professor Merriman talks about this phenomenon that occurred in the years following the war called Vichy syndrome.
The Vichy syndrome.
Which was this phenomena of people collectively forgetting that there was a large percentage of people in France who indeed supported the Vichy regime. And there was a lot of suppression of discussion media that talked about who was a collaborator, how deep did this collaboration go in business and everyday life. These stories weren't told until the 1980s even, 40 years after the fact. Professor Merriman gave this really funny example of a French singer, Maurice Chevalier.
Maurice Chevalier, who was a sort of chanteur, the sort of crooner of your grandparents' generation, who became the famous French person in the U.S.
This French archetypical guy that when you think of the French guy that talks like this, that's the guy that you're thinking about. Even though you don't know you're thinking about him, that's that guy. And that guy used to go around talking about how he would only sing for the boys.
He was only singing for the boys. That is, the people who had gone off and been captured in the fighting, or who had gone and had to go in the obligatory service.
But in reality, he sang for the Germans.
Goodness.
However, Renault has a change of heart.
Round up the usual suspects.
Rick shoots Major Strasser before he has an opportunity to stop the plane from taking off, with Ilsa and Victor getting out of Casablanca. And Captain Renault does not tell the rest of the police what Rick has done, and indeed lets him go, leaving with Rick.
And that 10,000 francs should pay our expenses.
Our expenses?
Gay. Yes, Rick chooses to return to his anti-fascist roots. Yes, our anti-fascist heroes do get out in the plane.
Yeah, boy.
But it's Captain Renault who saves the ending of the movie, because the ending of the movie was something that the entire creative team labored over up until basically shooting time. They were going to shoot it multiple ways because nobody knew how to end this story.
No, we didn't have the script. It was written as we went along, and to tell you the truth, no one knew how to end it. So we went along until the bitter end. And it was very bitter because they said I should shoot it both ways. Either I should go with the husband in the plane, played by Paul Hendry, or stay on the ground with Humphrey Bogart.
For a good period of time, the script called for Rick shooting Major Strasser and being arrested, carried off, and that's how the film ends. A sad, tragic, but heroic note to go out on. Also one that would have totally stunk and ruined the ending of the movie.
Oh, but that's silly.
Casablanca is Casablanca because of that ending. An ending that just hit the writers in a moment of inspiration, literally as they drove to the set to deliver the idea. And it's Captain Renault, this odious man, who gives us this ending. Yes, it's a bit of a fairy tale. There weren't a lot of Renaults that magically switched sides and saved the day. But in this modern day fairy tale, it feels good that Captain Renault gives up his life of luxury and privilege for what?
In Casablanca, I am master of my fate.
For a life on the run? Obviously, they're going to find out Rick was the one who did it. Why does he do this? He does it because he rejects Vichy. He rejects this idea that just because somebody told him to, just because that's his job,
I have my orders,
just because he can live his life however he wants, doesn't mean that that's what you should do. And it's never too late to make the right decision. And everything was good again in Casablanca. Well, unless you were Moroccan. Part 3. Imperialism. Focused? Good. Hello everybody, this is Editor Adam again. I know my hair has gotten a little bit longer. We're going to do this section a bit differently. We're going to do it a bit more natural, a bit less theatrical. I wasn't feeling too great about this section the way it was originally written, and when I was looking at the footage and doing some further research, I came across some information that made me go, you know what? Yeah, let's redo it, and let's make it a learning experience. Let's bring the audience along this journey, because I think it teaches an important lesson on what the initial topic was to begin with. And if you don't mind, I'm going to be reading from my notes a little bit as we go along. This section is on Morocco, on its history, on colonization, and the legacy of imperialism. I can't talk about everything to do with Casablanca that I want in this video, but I feel like not talking about Morocco in a movie set in Casablanca, its most famous city, was not an option. Especially when you think about the fact that the majority of criticisms or discussion in this movie glosses over this French Morocco aspect.
To Casablanca in French Morocco.
I found a great discussion in Shone Matgamna's article, of course, but in general in the discourse, this is something that people just sort of hop right over. So let's talk about it. By the events of Casablanca, Morocco had been a French territory for over 20 years. Prior to that, the Moroccans had defended themselves from the Spanish, and prior to that, the Portuguese. There's one point in the film that Victor Laszlo proudly declares that he's standing on free French soil.
I've never accepted that privilege, and I'm now on French soil.
I should like to discuss some matters arising from your presence on French soil, French soil, French soil.
A statement that feels particularly pernicious when you consider that by this point, tens of thousands of people in Morocco and in nearby Algeria had been brutalized by the French regime, a regime that was quickly racing to carve up the continent along with its imperial brothers and sisters during what we call the scramble for Africa, when European countries quite literally raced each other to carve up the continent for resources and an increasing sense of glory. The greatness of a nation was measured by the size of its empire. And I want to talk about this African identity because in my reading, Morocco as an African country with a richly African history was something that just leapt out. I learned a lot about the native Africans who inhabited the land, the Amazigh people who have ties back as far as 10,000 BC, so prehistory. Tamazight is one of their dialects and is spoken by quite a few people in Morocco and in the North African countries. 60% of Morocco identifies as Amazigh. So this is the majority of people in a country that a lot of people think of as an Arab country predominantly. This is due to a more recent phenomenon called pan-Arabization, in which Islamic countries have been uniting under growing Arab influence. Today, Arabic is given preferential status, and of course, Arabic has been spoken in this region going back since the Muslim conquest in the 7th century. But keep in mind that for the majority of history, the peoples who have lived in this land are Amazigh, with Amazigh culture mixing with Islamic culture, and even in the great Almohad dynasty in the 11th century, this was an Islamic empire, but also not an Arab empire, but an African empire. Keep in mind that Amazigh languages were the lingua franca of this region. So I'm doing all of this research. I'm reading from academic articles, I'm pulling from reputable news sources, and I watch a couple documentaries. And believe it or not, let's say 8 times out of 10, I'm not reading the word Amazigh. I'm reading the word Berber. So what's the difference?
They're called the Berber, but nearly half the population still speak Berber, but they maintain their traditional Berber customs.
At some point, I became confused. I wanted to know what the difference was, so I Googled it, and here's what I found out. Berber is not a Tamazight word, or in any Amazigh dialect. It is derived from Greek, barbaroi, and if you're feeling kind of gross right now, yes, it's because it means barbarian. At the time, anybody who didn't speak Greek was a barbarian, but it's been used throughout history basically to refer to these group of people as barbarians. It is quite literally a slur, and increasingly you will see people talk about it in those terms. And it was being used during the era of colonization and is still used as the central way to talk about these people today. When I tried explaining this to my dad, because I was just kind of, reeling from this information, he was like, well, think about how we refer to, or for the longest time, Americans referred to Native Americans as Indians, right? India has nothing to do with Native Americans, and even that word Native Americans, that has nothing to do with the tribes of the peoples who have lived here. So he was like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. And it also made sense to me how something so common and something that from an outsider's perspective, you're like, whoa, that's crazy. But you're like, oh, actually, when people have been marginalized to that degree, when their language has been repressed, keep in mind, Amazigh languages were the lingua franca, but after colonization, Amazigh language were not recognized. And it wasn't until 2011 that Tamazight was recognized as a language in Morocco, 2011. Then you go, oh, wow. Okay, yeah, this is not hard to believe at all. So here I am, trying to read, trying to educate myself, trying to put together information to package and give to you. And I am drawing on the legacy of imperialism, going off of academic literature, going off of respected news sources, going off of the New York Times. I've got this great example and I want to show you. So here's an article from 1982. It's called, "In Morocco, a Berber Face Hides Beneath an Arab Mask." And there's one paragraph in particular that I want to focus on. The word Berber may have been, this is the fourth paragraph. The word Berber may have been derived from barbari, the Greek and Roman terms for foreigners. But the Berbers' word for Berber is Amazigh, which means free man. And their culture exemplifies this principle. So did you see what happened? How it's the Berbers' word for Berber is Amazigh, which is great, interesting from an academic perspective. Ooh, what an interesting factoid. But the whole article goes on to say Berber, and that is because that is the commonly used term. That's not until recent efforts have been successful to push back on this. The resistance to this has been ongoing, obviously, since colonialism, but I'm saying it's not until recent victories, like 2011, that Tamazight was a recognized language in a country where 60% of the people speak Tamazight. It's also important to keep in mind that French is increasingly the language of success in Morocco, and that if you grew up in a Tamazight-speaking household and you were not taught French as a child, that you are going to struggle in school if you're not particularly good at picking up languages, because the language of science, the language of investment, the language of media is French or Arabic. And in schools in particular, the way that they tier their schools, the higher tiers, the schools that get the most money are schools that exclusively teach STEM, and STEM is taught in French. So the legacy of colonialism lives on in all kinds of ways, quite literally at every level I put here. And we're watching a movie called Casablanca, named after its most famous city, a name that comes from Portuguese, not Spanish as you might have heard. There's literally not one Moroccan character. Not one. Neither Amazigh, nor Arab, nor even Jew, who Morocco has been home to quite a large Jewish population for a long time. In truth, Casablanca was chosen quite literally as a prop, and that's about as far as it goes as the representation on the screen. This is due, sadly, in large part to how people at the time saw the East or the mysterious faraway lands, and this became the belief wherever European colonial influence spread, so did, freedom, free French soil. Matgamna points out that, in fact, this Casablanca is a place already well known in Hollywood westerns, a staple of American cowboy films. That town west of the... West?
East. Oh, east? I thought you said west. West.
That town west of the Picos, or wherever the law does not run and outlaws gather. And Rick is essentially buying into this narrative too, right? He flees to Casablanca after the Germans invade Paris because he hears the waters are healing.
My help. I came to Casablanca for the waters.
I know he's being sarcastic, but he has this flawed, skewed idea of where the law does not exist. And it's false. So I guess if there's any silver lining to the ending of the story, it's one in which Rick realizes that this fantasy that he's created for himself is something that he has to leave, and that everybody wants to flee Casablanca, right? Waiting. Everybody's trapped in Casablanca. Everybody wants to get out. That our protagonist achieves not just getting out, but getting out of this idea that he's built up in his head. Casablanca was never La Belle Aurore for Rick, and it never was. It never was. That's not everything that I wanted to talk about, but I can't talk about everything. I'm going to transition now, quite awkwardly, to the end of the video. I'm wearing my trench coat again and my hat, so shield your eyes. Here we go. Conclusion. So, the greatest movie ever made? Hardly. It wasn't even Michael Curtiz's favorite of his own movies. That was Yankee Doodle Dandy. The composer Max Steiner hated As Time Goes By, and they practically had to force him to put it into the score. Casablanca is a movie that basically begs to be critiqued, to be opened up and used as a launch pad for further discussions on the rise of fascism, on resistance, and what that even means, on all sorts of things, on the plight of refugees, on the history of Morocco, on all kinds of ways to make a new and informed contemporary reading of the picture. But I do love this movie. I do. I really do. And I will continue loving it. And I hope you continue loving it. For all of the reasons people have talked about before. For its acting, its cinematography, for its wonderful score, all kinds of things. But I don't want that to be the whole story. If we're going to keep talking about this movie in its near legendary religious holy status, if we're going to play it every year at Harvard, at film festivals, then we also should be aware of the political and historical implications at the center of this story. Screenings should also be followed with panels hosted by historians, journalists, activists, all talking about the different ways to view this film. This is what Rick meant when he said that the problems of a few little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. Well, all of the praise, all of the Academy Awards, all of the accolades, all of the status don't amount to a hill of beans in the world if you're not making the viewing experience meaningful. If you grew a little, if you learned something new, if you challenged your biases, yes, even about the movie itself. A new way to watch Casablanca. Who knows? It may be the start of a beautiful friendship.
I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
I said that. I said it. I said the line. I said the line. I said the line. I said the line.